In the last lecture, we witnessed the callback hell, but promises come to the rescue. So what are promises? Promises are objects that either return the successfully fetched data or the error. This might be a bit confusing, so let's create a promise. I'm gonna comment out all of this code here by highlighting it and then pressing Command and then /. Now we can keep writing code just below, but don't delete this because we're gonna come back to it and refactor it to use promises. So in here, great, line 33, promises. So let's create a promise, and we can do that like this. Const promise is going to be equal to new promise. Notice how in here we are using that new constructor keyword, and then in there promise accepts a callback function. So let's create a callback function right there and expand the block of code. In here, promise gets two different parameters, the resolve and the reject. So what are we creating our promise for? Let's create it for the first example in our previous code. In here, the fetch user. So I'm gonna take that, paste it in here just so we can see it, and now let's try to replicate that. Const promise is equal to new promise, and then the same thing is gonna be happening. In here, we have the set timeout, and that set timeout is console logging something and then calling this callback. But notice how in here, we don't have access to the callback. The only thing we do have access to are those two built-in things, the resolve and the reject. So if you want to send something back, you simply call resolve and that's it. Resolve is acting as a callback. Now we can rename this promise. It doesn't have to be promise. It can be something like fetch user. And that's it. We're basically doing the same thing. We're creating a promise called fetch promise, which resolves with the user. And now in here, we don't yet have the value for the username. So let's make the username equal to Michael. Great. Now with this, how do we call our promise? Well, you can do something like this. Fetch user, and now we have access to new syntax. It's called .then. .then, in here you can see it, the callback to execute when the promise is resolved. So when we call this resolve, you're going to get the .then, and then in there, you're going to get whatever you passed in the resolve. In this case, we have a callback function. And then as the first parameter and only parameter, we have this object, which is actually the user. So in here, we can say user, and then in here, we can do an instant return saying console log user.username. So we are returning the username. Now let's save that and see what happens. As you can see, after 2 seconds, now we have the user Michael. That's it. This still might be a bit weird for you seeing it for the first time, but I'm sure that you think it's just a bit easier than using the callbacks. Keep in mind that during the callbacks example, we didn't even test for the errors. When making requests, sometimes the data may not come back. The reason can be your internet connection, or maybe you're just fetching the data the wrong way. In any case, the fact is that sometimes you're not going to receive the data you were looking for, and we need to handle those cases. With promises, it's easy. You just replace the resolve with reject and pass our error message. In here, we can comment out this line and simply reject it. So we say reject user not found. So your question might be, okay, but where are we going to see this message? We are just rejecting it now, and it looks like this. With the .then, we also have access to the .catch in here. .catch is also a method which accepts a function, a callback function in there. But instead of the user, in here we get the actual error. So now what you can do is you can simply write console log error. Now if we remove this semicolon here, because these two are both being called on the same fetch user, and save it, now we should get the reject user not found. And as you can see, it works perfectly. Now if we remove this reject and simply bring back the resolve, only the .then is going to be called and we're going to get Michael. In the last example with callback functions, we had a lot of functions. So how can we deal with all of this using promises? Well, let's do it step by step. We just did it for the promises. So let's remove some of these comments here, the reject, and also remove these. And now we can take this over and paste it instead of the first function, which is the fetch user. Great. Now we can keep moving forwards and changing all of these callbacks to use promises. But before we start modifying these other things, let's first completely modify the fetch user. There's going to be a better way to actually put this. In here, we currently don't have the way to send over the parameter as a name. Notice that we hard-coded it here. So to change that, I'm going to copy the whole part and then start changing it just below. I'm going to comment this out. So we have to copy this for now and then simply open the set of parentheses so that we can send our parameters in. In here, specifically, we're sending in the username. And now, just above the set timeout, we have to return a new promise, which is going to wrap our set timeout. So that should look something like this. And looks like we are missing one thing, maybe a parenthesis. If we do that, let's see how it looks. There we go. That's it. I'm gonna leave this in the description if you mess something up with the parentheses or curly braces, but generally this is it. We have a function which accepts the username, and then it returns a new promise which resolves to that same username. So in here, we can do username is equal to username, or simply send over the object containing the username. That's it. Now we can delete this, and I know it's tough, but we're gonna explain this 2 more times on 2 different functions. So in here, we have fetch user photos. The fetch user photos now is going to return a new promise. So we can say return new promise. Promise has a callback function, so we have to write it like this. And then in there, we always get the resolve and the reject, just like so. Now, inside of that promise, we are simply going to copy the code for the set timeout and paste it there. The only thing we have to change is from callback to resolve. And then we can remove the callback from parameters. To repeat it one more time, let's go over to the last function. In there, our function is again not going to need a callback, and it's going to return a new promise. That is a new promise. Again, it accepts a callback function. In there, it has the resolve and the reject. And what we have to do is put this set timeout inside of that promise and exchange the callback with the resolve. That's the only thing we have to do. Now we successfully modified all 3 of our functions to use promises. And now, finally, we have to call to get the output. No longer will we be using this, not using this. These are callbacks. So this is the function using callbacks. And now let me show you how easy it is to get the photo details, so the final thing we want to get, using promises. So in here, we're gonna call the fetch user, and then we can specify what do we want to pass in, what name. So we said Michael. Now you simply call the .then on it, that then accepts a callback function, and then as the parameter of that function, we get something. Let's see what do we get. Well, we get the object, which is basically our user. So in here, we can say user. Once we have the user, we can start calling the second function, and that is fetch user photos. And now we can pass in the user.username for which we want to call the photos. Then again, this is a promise, right? So we can just add another .then. We are saying after you get the user here, then call fetch user photos. And now we are saying after you get the user photos, then do something. So in here, what do we get? We get the photos. And then after we get the photos, you can simply call fetch photo details, and then in there, pass the photos 0, just like so. And then finally, after we have the photo details, you can do another .then because we're working with a promise again. And then in here, you get the details. And what do you want to do with the details? Well, the same thing we wanted to do here. Your details are, and then simply console log them. So now, if I just fix this properly, we want to remove the comment and the indentation. There we go, console log, your photo details are details. Let's save it and see what do we get back. First of all, after 2 seconds, now we have the user. 2 more seconds, now we have the photos for Michael. 2 more seconds, now we have the photo details, and then photo details are details. So to conclude, this thing from line 40 to 43 is absolutely the same thing we have above, but notice how much easier this is to both read and write. We never again have to use callback functions. Promises are enabling us to write asynchronous code in a much easier way. But recently, there has been an addition to promises. It's called async await, and we're going to check it out in the next lecture, so stay tuned.